Have you ever heard the name Peter? Of course you have. He was one of Jesus' 12 apostles and one of the first martyrs of the Christian faith. But how much do you know about him beyond that? In this episode, we are going to talk about some of the lesser-known details of his life, death, and legacy. So let's jump right into it. Peter was originally named Simon. That was his Hebrew name. But Jesus called him Peter, which was a Greek name, and he called him that because he wanted to signify the kind of man that Simon would become. You see, Jesus renamed him from Simon to Peter in John chapter 1, verse 42. And the name change is very interesting because it actually means rock or you stone. And that's significant because Jesus told Simon Peter that he was going to build his church on the rock that is his son. So the name change really signifies that Peter would be the foundation of the Christian church. But there's another interesting thing about Peter's name change. If you look at Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, it says that Jesus said to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And many people believe that this passage actually has a play on words in the original language, and that's because the word rock in Aramaic could also be translated as confession. And that's exactly what Peter made when he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So maybe Jesus didn't just rename him for the church, but also to signify the personal confession that he had just made. Now, not only was Peter one of the first disciples of Jesus, he was also one of the most enthusiastic. He was often quick to speak up with ideas and plans. For example, in Matthew chapter 14, after the feeding of the 5,000, Peter and the rest of the disciples were in a boat with Jesus sailing across the lake. And they were scared because a storm was coming and they were worried that they were going to die. But Peter tells Jesus, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." And Jesus rebuked him and said, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" And then he calmed the winds and the waves, and the men were astonished, and they praised God, saying, "What a wonderful miracle we have seen today. Truly, you are the Son of God." So Peter was so bold as to suggest they sail out into the middle of the lake so they could meet Jesus. And when he walked on water to meet Jesus, he was afraid that he was going to drown. But still he did it anyway. And that goes to show you that Peter was a man full of enthusiasm and courage. However, Peter also struggled with his faith. After Jesus told them that he needed to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, he took issue with that. And in Matthew 16, verse 22, it says, "He took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you.' But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men.'" So Peter was not perfect. In fact, he was quite flawed, but God chose him anyway. And that's something we can all learn from. We don't need to be perfect to be used by God. He can use us just as we are. So we can learn from Peter's example, but we can also learn from his faithfulness. And one of the areas where we see his faithfulness was in his love for fishing. You see, before becoming a disciple of Jesus, Peter was a fisherman by trade. And when Jesus called him, he left everything to follow Jesus. But later, after Jesus was crucified and the disciples went back to their old lives, Peter went back to what he knew best, fishing. In John chapter 21, we read about this event. It says, "After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he didn't reveal himself to them in a dream, but while they were having breakfast. Now, Simon Peter, Thomas Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. So Simon Peter said to them, 'I am going fishing.' They said to him, 'We are going too.' So they got into the boat and left at once for the place where they had set the nets. And Simon Peter said, 'I will throw in the nets for one last time for your sake, and then I will put them up on the beach and we will be done with fishing.' So they did. And now the net was filled with a huge number of fish, and the fish were large and strong. And immediately after, the young man said to Simon Peter, 'It's a miracle, I tell you. I tell you, we've caught a huge number of fish.' And when the other disciple whom Jesus loved, that same one who had leaned against Jesus at supper, and had heard him say, "When you are old, you will walk in your youth." And he said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his clothes, because he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, and they followed him. When they got on land, they saw a fire there, and a table with fish and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Peter came up and dragged the net ashore, full of 153 large fish. And although so many fish, yet not one of them was hurting. Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." And none of the disciples dared to ask him, or even the one who had caught the fish, "Who are you?" knowing it was the Lord. Jesus said, "Are you still so slow to understand? Do you still need more proof? Look at the fish. You can eat them, but they're neither prepared nor cooked, yet you can eat them raw. Come over here and have breakfast." Then he said to Peter, "Stretch out your hand and put your spear through the fish and dip it into the water. Take it out and eat. This will make you well and strengthen you." Now, Peter had been a fisherman all his life, but after following Jesus, he hadn't fished. And that may have made him feel uncomfortable, like he was betraying what he once did. But Peter didn't let that stop him. He still fished. And I think that teaches us a great lesson. Don't feel guilty over pursuing the gifts that God gave you, even if you feel like you haven't been using them. And when Peter and the disciples went to fish that day, they didn't realize that they were fulfilling an Old Testament prophecy. Jesus said to them, "Cast your nets into the sea. It is the Lord speaking." And that reminds me of Ezekiel 47:10, where the prophet Ezekiel is given a vision of a river flowing from the temple of the Lord. And the man who he was told to measure the river says, No, wait, we must catch fish in it and plant crops along its banks." So these Old Testament prophecies point forward to a time when God will cause a miraculous increase of fish so that his people could be fed. And in Peter's case, they pulled in 153 large fish, which is such a big catch that it symbolizes abundance and miraculous increase. Also, Jesus instructed Peter to take the fish and eat it raw without preheating. The Untold Stories of Peter, Apostle, Martyr, and Faithful Follower, a pairing it. And that reminded the disciples that they didn't have to wait for the Messiah to come before they ate the fruit of the kingdom. And remember that Jesus said in Matthew 9:35, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few." Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And in this passage, it seems like Jesus is answering that prayer. He is sending out fishermen to catch fish for food, and in doing so, they are fulfilling the scriptures. So let's learn from Peter's example. Let's be enthusiastic in our faith. Let's be faithful to the callings of God. And let's never forget that we don't have to wait for Jesus to return before we experience the goodness of God. We can experience it right now. And that's the end of part 1 of this series. But in part 2, we're going to talk more about Peter's martyrdom and how he died for his faith in Jesus. Stay tuned for that video. Coming soon, please leave us a comment below if you like this video and share it with your friends. And thank you for watching.